English listening.
We've really got to decide who does what for our Natural Earth project.
Okay, Alice. Well, we've got all our cloud research, so let's decide how to break it down.
Well, we should probably start by saying how clouds are formed.
Good idea. And then maybe move on to the different types of clouds. We can separate it into low-lying, medium-level, and high clouds. What do you think, Jenny?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. And we should also make a PowerPoint to make it a bit more interesting and put in pictures of the different clouds.
Good idea, Jenny. We should probably have cue cards too. I'm useless at remembering what to say without them.
Yes, me too. Well, I'm quite happy to organize everything we found out about clouds and make sure it fits into our presentation times.
Actually, I'd better do that. I've got all the research on my computer, so it makes sense. How about if you make the presentation slides, Carl?
Okay, Alice, that's fine by me.
Well, if you guys are going to do that, then I'll look on the internet for pictures of the different types of clouds.
That'll be great, Jenny. I'll also make the prompt cards so we don't forget what we're saying during the presentation.
Sounds great. Let's have a run-through on Tuesday. What sections does everyone want to talk about? I don't really mind.
I hate speaking in front of people, so I'd prefer not to do the introduction.
I don't mind. I'll do that. If you don't want to talk much, then why don't you just do the middle bit about the medium-level clouds?
Yes, I can do the low-level and high-level clouds part. I'm sure Jenny can handle the summarizing too.
Thanks, guys. We can all take questions together.
Track 2.
Hi, Roger.
Debbie, hi, how are you?
Oh, I've been struggling with my Natural Earth assignment. It's proving to be really difficult.
The one for Professor Black? Me too. I'm writing about volcanic activity. What are you doing yours on?
Acid rain. I thought that would be okay, but the process is really complicated.
Well, I can help you with it. I know a lot about acid rain. I studied the causes and effects last year.
Really? Oh, that's great. I've done some work on the causes. I'm going to write that acid rain is caused by sulfur dioxide from power plants and smelters. Basically, this reacts in the atmosphere to form acid rain.
Ah, but it's not just sulfur dioxide. It's also nitrogen oxides.
Really?
Yes, from things like car exhausts.
But aren't nitrogen oxides also caused by natural events too?
Yes, they're a minor factor, but I think they're worth mentioning. But sorry, carry on.
Thanks. I might add that. So anyway, these emissions react in the atmosphere with water, oxygen and oxidants to form acidic compounds like sulfuric acid. These compounds then fall to Earth.
Are you going to mention the different ways they return to the ground?
Do you mean wet and dry deposition?
Yes. So you've done a bit of background reading then?
Yes. So if I've got it right, acid rain often comes down as rain, but also as snow or fog. This is wet deposition. I'm also going to define it as any form of precipitation that removes acids from the atmosphere.
Yes, I think that's a good term to define it.
Dry deposition. Well, I think that's when the pollutants stick to the ground through dust. I'm not really sure how to define it, though, compared to wet deposition.
Just think of it as any pollutants that are not caused through precipitation. That's probably the best way. Did you know that sunlight can enhance the effects of acid rain as well?
No, I didn't. Oh, there's so much to think about. I'm sure I'll go over my word limit.
Well, you sound like you know a lot about the subject. Just try and keep your focus. I've had the same problem writing about volcanoes. There's just so much.
Track 3.
Do you want to make a start on our Natural Earth project? I think our idea of a lightning safety presentation is great. Don't you, Rachel?
Yes, I think it'll be really good. I have a few ideas already.
Oh, great. Me too. I think we should divide it into 2 parts. What to do if you're inside when lightning strikes and what to do if you're outside. What do you think?
That's good, but we need more. Something about planning for this kind of event. And also, what to do if someone gets hit by lightning.
Oh, I can't believe I forgot that. Of course. Well, what should we talk about in the first part?
I think we should say it's important to be aware. Lightning is always before rain, so don't wait until it rains. As soon as you hear thunder or lightning, you should get inside.
OK, yes. And then if you're indoors, you should avoid water, stay away from doors and windows, and don't use the telephone.
Or any electrical equipment. In fact, if you can, switch it off first. And you should wait half an hour after the last clap of thunder before going back outside.
And if you're outside when it storms, you also need to avoid water. Try and get inside as soon as possible. There are certain things you should avoid. Open spaces, anything large and made of metal. And of course, the obvious one, trees.
But we should mention that if lightning strikes very near you, you need to crouch down.
Oh, is that right? I thought you had to stand still.
No, that's actually wrong. You're supposed to crouch down.
And put your hands over your ears. The noise can damage your hearing if you don't. OK, I think we've got quite a lot here. Only the last part to go. Now, what to do if someone gets hit?
I think we should say that it's very rare for someone to get hit by lightning. Our talk sounds as if there's danger all around. We should try and make it sound a bit more reassuring.
Yes, you're right. We'll say it doesn't happen often. It's just better to be safe than sorry. But what should we say about getting hit by lightning?
Well, I think we should say it's safe to touch people who've been hit by lightning. They don't have any electrical charge. If there's a first aider around, then they should help them. Otherwise, it's just best to call for an ambulance. And we should remind our audience that 80% of lightning victims don't get fatally injured. That should calm everyone's nerves.
Track 4.
So, I think we'd better start planning what we're going to do for our group project. Have you guys had any ideas?
I was thinking we should do something on extreme weather events, but I think Alex had some different ideas.
Yes, maybe we should look into more localised weather conditions and the effects on the immediate environment.
That's a good idea, Alex. But I don't think we'd be able to get much data on that. And we don't really have time to do our own research. What about doing something about the seasons?
I think the seasons might be a bit too wide-reaching, when we take into account the wind patterns and pressure systems.
Maybe you're right.
Well, how about Tom's idea of extreme weather conditions?
Yes, that sounds like a good idea. It's easy to break down into separate parts, and it certainly sounds more interesting.
I'd quite like to cover monsoons. I've been doing some reading on them and they're quite interesting.
Well, that sounds good. We should maybe take 2 areas each. That would make it easier for us to focus.
Well, we've got lots to choose from. We could do blizzards, heat waves, droughts, cyclones. There are loads. Why don't you do blizzards too, Tom?
I don't fancy doing them, but I wouldn't mind doing something on floods. They're linked to monsoons, I think, so it will be an easy transition. What do you fancy doing, Alex?
Well, I could always cover winds.
But that isn't really extreme enough.
I could do hurricanes. They're pretty exciting. How about doing cyclones, Emma?
I'd rather do heat waves and droughts, I think. I know a bit about them. I don't know anything about cyclones.
Cyclones are really interesting. I can cover them.
That sounds great. I was thinking about doing cyclones, but I'm happy for you to do them.
Track 5.
As we have seen, changes in the structure of the family are constantly occurring. Extended to nuclear, patrifocal to a more equal footing between the sexes, and dual parenting to single parenting. However, a recent phenomenon in the UK, which is changing the traditional family, is the increasing number of adults who continue to live with their parents until their 30s or sometimes even their 40s. The UK has traditionally been a society where offspring leave the family home in their late teens or early 20s to set up their own home and families. But in the last 25 years, this has decreased. Official statistics released by the Office of National Statistics show that today 10% of men in their early 30s still live with their parents. This compares with 5% of women in this age range. The reasons for this are complex and varied. It cannot be denied that some people are choosing to stay at home. Living with parents can be an easy option. Food is provided, heating and electricity are paid for, and rent, if any, is minimal. However, a third of those surveyed claimed they are living with their parents because it is too difficult to get on the property ladder. House prices in the last few decades have risen dramatically. Property is now 5 times the average annual salary, whereas it was only 3 times the average annual wage in the 1980s. This fact, coupled with high unemployment amongst young people, makes it virtually impossible for a single person to buy a home or even rent. The number of students going on to higher education has also been steadily increasing. Many of these students return home after finishing their studies as a result of the student debt they have accumulated. It can take many years to pay this off, and if the burden of rent or a mortgage is added to that, it can be just too much for a young adult's pocket. However, help is now at hand. The government is tackling some of the problems that cause people to remain with their parents with a new scheme, the Affordable Housing Scheme. This aims to help people part buy a house or flat by making housing more affordable for first-time buyers and possibly taking the strain away from elderly parents.
Track 6.
In Victorian times, the upper classes made up less than 3% of the entire population of Britain, yet this class held more than 90% of the country's wealth. This shows the massive gap there was between rich and poor, a gap which has shrunk considerably in the last century. Today, we're going to look at the wide differences in family life between rich and poor in Victorian times. Let's begin with the upper classes. The upper classes of the Victorian period were generally the nobility or the clergy. Most of their servants were very poorly paid, but were always accommodated within the homes of upper-class Victorian families, so they didn't have to pay for accommodation, food, and often clothing. The money which they did earn, they normally sent home to their families. Many Victorian servants came from the countryside, where the effects of the Industrial Revolution had resulted in job losses. Amongst these servants were cooks, housemaids, stable hands and butlers. The family would also employ a nanny, who, although employed by the family, was not traditionally seen as a servant. A nanny's primary role was to care for the children. She was responsible for teaching the children how to behave, looking after them when they were ill, and instilling discipline into them. Nannies did not, however, educate the children. Generally, children from wealthy families did not attend school outside the family home. Tutors would come to the house to do this, and although on occasion mothers taught their children to read and fathers gave their children some instruction in Latin, this was not a common occurrence. Now, the Victorian upper classes had the reputation of being quite cruel, but this wasn't always the case. They were also quite charitable. Ragged schools were set up with funding from the upper classes so that poor children could have some form of education. Additionally, most Victorian parents were very proud of their children, who were often seen as prized possessions. This goes against the common idea that parents were very hard on their children. In fact, the opposite was generally the rule. However, the situation for lower-class families was very different. In the lower classes, child labour was rife. Children, as young as 8, earned a living as chimney sweeps for wealthy houses. Now, let's move on to looking at the lower-class families in more detail. You'll find that very often...
Track 7.
We are all familiar with the nuclear family, which has been the dominant family structure in the UK for the last 60 years at least. However, recent changes show that our idea of the traditional nuclear family as the cornerstone of British family life is changing. There have been emerging patterns which are eroding this structure, namely the rise of step families, cohabitation, lone parenting, and the rapid increase in those living alone. We are going to explore these areas in turn and look at their effect in terms of the family. Firstly, step families are becoming more and more common. Step families are created when one or both partners have a child or children from a previous relationship. In 1980, the percentage of children under 13 who were living with one parent and their new partner was just 4%. In 2008, this figure had increased to 20%. The USA has seen an even greater rise. New statistics show that almost half of under 13s are living in a step family. Now, we can still call the step family structure a nuclear family, as it does follow the structure of two parents and dependent children. However, it also creates somewhat of a nuclear blur. Step brothers and sisters may belong to two family units, so where do we draw the line at which family they belong to? Cohabitation, when partners do not marry yet live together as a family, has also increased. In 2006, of the 17.5 million families in Britain, nearly 3 million of these comprised unmarried couples. What does this mean to the nuclear family? Firstly, the traditional view of a nuclear family requires married parents, so we can't put these types of family under this umbrella. Statistics show that even if cohabiting couples have children, they are more likely to separate than their married equivalents. Lastly, we need to look at the rise of the DINKs, which stands for Dual Income, No Kids. As Clark and Henwood outline, many cohabiting couples are choosing a life without children, putting consumer spending first. Lone parenting is a relatively recent family structure, which has rapidly grown in the last half-century. In 1972, only 1 in 14 children lived in a lone parent family. When we compare this with today's figure of 1 in 4, we can see that this is a rapid increase. In the past, lone parenthood was overwhelmingly the result of a death of a parent. Nowadays, however, it is increasingly a choice. Some sociologists argue that this increase is due to the outlook of women. Where women once were willing to accept an unhappy or abusive marriage, now many will choose lone parenthood. Often, this can be just a transitory phase before they find a new partner. This view of women's attitudes and lone parenting is highly debated because some figures show that the largest group of lone parents are mothers who have never married. You can find counter-arguments for these ideas in Butler and Jones. One difficulty for single parents is that they are a social group who are much more likely to suffer from poverty and hardship. They are more likely to live in rented accommodation and have childcare issues. Lastly, an increasing number of people are choosing to live alone. The number of people living alone in Britain has more than doubled in the last 20 years. In 1990, just over 4 million people lived alone. Now this figure has reached 8.5 million, an incredibly rapid growth which has had enormous effects on the traditional nuclear family. This number represents a great chunk of the population who, either by choice or necessity, are outside the traditional family unit. Some think that these changes may not help the community. In fact, there are many arguments that this rise in alternative household structures will create a more isolationist and less community-based society, where close bonds, which are usually formed within the family, have no place. Leaving aside whether or not the housing even exists for this boom, an important factor which must be looked at is the disproportionate expense for those living on their own. By this I mean the burden of all costs is shouldered by one wage instead of two, and of course one person is using the energy which could be shared between a group, having a greater impact on the environment too. However, on a more positive note, people, especially women, are proving to be extremely